Good afternoon. Welcome to the Spring 2021 webinar series. The meeting will begin shortly. So grab a quick sip of your morning coffee if you're late on it, and I'm excited to get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Spring 2021 webinar series from the Virginia Association of Wetland Professionals. I'm Katie Lavanino, Rising President. I'll be taking over from our past president, Laura Rader-Dixon. She'll be providing our presentation next week at the March 31st annual meeting, which we're excited about. This is the fourth of 5 webinars in our spring webinar series, and this is in lieu of our annual spring meeting. We're very excited about this platform and all of the great participation. A few housekeeping items. The Survey Monkey went out from Brian Bressinger at BOP, and that is for our spring 2021 elections. That'll be for the 2021 officers. And if you could make sure to vote before the March 31st meeting, that'd be fantastic. The website, VA Wetlands, is listed on the slide. Please be sure to visit and join BOP. Because we're bringing great presentation materials to you, and we're excited to continue to do that throughout an interesting 2020 and the start of an interesting 2021. We have 2 speakers today speaking on the Antecedent Precipitation Tool, or APT. Eli Wright from Timmons Group is a senior environmental scientist, will be speaking second. And to start us off, we'll have Dr. Herman Hudson III, Wes, from the Army Corps of Engineers as an environmental specialist. And they'll be speaking again on the Antecedent Precipitation Tool, which is an automated tool that the Army Corps of Engineers developed following implementation of the Navigable Water Protection Rule, or NWPR, in 2020. The ATP is used to facilitate the comparison of antecedent or recent rainfall conditions for a given location to the range of normal rainfall conditions that occurred during the preceding 30 years. In addition to providing a standard methodology to evaluate normal precipitation conditions, the APT can be used to assess the presence of drought conditions, as well as the approximate dates of wet and dry seasons for a given location. Join us in a review and discussion of the APT with Wes and Eli. A quick note about the speakers and the format of the presentation. As I mentioned, Wes will be speaking first. We won't be taking questions after his presentation. Eli will come in right after, and then we'll be using the Q&A feature, which is should be on the right-hand side of your screen. This is probably flipped, so that may not have looked right. We'll be taking questions. Ben and I will be alternating them at the end, given the amount of time we've got left. A note, Wes completed a Bachelor of Science in Ornamental Horticulture and a Master's of Science from Christopher Newport University, and completed his doctorate at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, College William & Mary. His research focused on forested wetland restoration and creation, with a particular interest in tree survival and growth and implications for compensatory mitigation performance standards. Wes joined the Army Corps of Engineers Norfolk Regulatory Branch in 2017, where he continues to review proposed activities under the Clean Water Act and the Rivers and Harbors Act and perform complex jurisdictional determinations. Eli completed a Master of Science in Environmental Science from Christopher Newport University. I'm also a CNU rep, so go CNU. In 2015, where his thesis research focused on success of planted vegetation within Virginia created wetland mitigation sites. Since that time, Eli pursues a career as an environmental consultant focusing on Clean Water Act, state surface water regulatory compliance. He served as project lead throughout Virginia in various projects, including wetland delineations, stream assessments, permitting, and Eli is both a Virginia Certified Professional Wetland Delineator and Society of Wetland Science Professional Wetland Scientist, and serves as the VOP Education Committee Chair. With that, I'd be happy to turn it over to Wes. Please take it away.
Thanks, Katie. Appreciate the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I was hoping that you might be able to see me for a second, but that may or may not be working. Oh, maybe there I am. Hey, everybody out there. welcome. It's raining here in Richmond, which seems very appropriate for the topic today, and also appropriate for our vault meetings. It always seems to be raining, so we're thankful for that. So I'm going to stop sharing my video and share my screen here, which hopefully you can see. Yeah, so today, as Katie mentioned, we're going to be talking about the Antecedent Precipitation Tool, and I'm going to briefly touch on the Navigable Water Protection Rule and our definition of typical year. And I'd like to mention that a lot of this presentation came straight from USACE headquarters, so grateful for them to putting together these materials. And over here on the right-hand side, you see a site over here where this is a site in Chesterfield, and question is that a typical year, and is that a wetland? Difficult to answer questions, right? This was actually taken last year during August of 2020, and if everyone remembers, it was historically wet times, so interesting conditions there in that site. And also that is overcup oak, Quercus lyrata, so really interesting site there. So we're going to just a little bit of background to get us started, why we're using this, what it means, what the definitions are, how we use the tool, and how we interpret it. And I'd like to give a big thanks to VOP and the Timmons Group today for hosting and having the core present today. And I'd like to say that the past presentations last week were phenomenal. Mitchell Doyle, his email is listed here. I can't remember if he shared this, but he's graduating this year, and he is in need of a job. And I can say that anyone that works in the Dismal Swamp and Alligator River is very field hardy. So reach out to him. And thanks for Doug for his excellent presentation last week as well on invasive species. So jumping right into it, the Navigable Water Protection Rule, which became effective last year. And what it does is it's defining our scope of our waters, which we call aquatic resources that are federally regulated under the Clean Water Act. And specifically, this rule was focused on the definition of waters in the United States found at that section of the Code of Federal Regulations. And it established 4 categories of jurisdictional waters and 12 categories of excluded waters or features. So piece of cake, pretty simple. Maybe not so much, but in these definitions, they actually rely on this concept of typical year. And for example, the definition of adjacent wetlands, it references direct hydrologic surface connections through or over an artificial structure in a typical year. So we got to figure out what this typical year means. So they provide a definition at C13, and it states that it's when precipitation and other climatic variables are within normal periodic range for a specific area based on a 30-year period. So we can see that there is some vague terms there as well. Normal periodic range, they give some examples, so we kind of have to look at what that means. Geographic area, so that could be small or large. The only thing that's really specific about this is the rolling 30-year period. And they state that the intent is really to look at these aquatic resources at times that are not too wet or not too dry. So the Goldilocks principle. And here at the core, we recognize for us that hitting those sites at that time is often a luxury and maybe a rare occurrence for us to get there during that time. So in practice, what we're really doing is we're trying to understand the climatic conditions when we're making observations, or when anyone is making observations, or when observations were made in the past. And so in the preamble to the actual rule, which I encourage everyone to read, the preamble is part of the Federal Register that precedes the rule and provides a lot of background information. And they say that typical year will generally be determined by looking at precipitation conditions based on 3 30-day periods preceding an observation date. And then for each of those periods, you assign a weighted condition value based on if you fall within the 30th or 70th percentile, which we're all familiar with from our WETS tables, from the same date range over the preceding 30 years. We'll get into detail on that. And then we make a determination of normal, wetter than normal, or drier than normal based on the condition value sum. And the important thing to point out is that this is one methodology for determining normal conditions. And there are other measurements of precipitation or other climate measurements that can be considered when scientifically warranted. And I wanted to spend just a brief second. Where did this 30-day preceding values come from? And as far as I can tell, it kind of goes back to engineering field handbook from the NRCS that is back in 1997, but it's been updated, and we still rely on this for other pieces of information. But in the lower right-hand side here, you can see where they're referencing condition values based on the first prior month, second prior month, and third prior month. So this technique has been used, this calculation has been used for quite a while. They also provide some other tools and resources that can be used to support making determinations of climatic conditions. And here you'll see them listed here in numerical order, with the APT tool being at the top. But these other ones are just as valid and can be equally useful, going all the way down there to physical and biological field indicators. So these are some other tools. And then here at Norfolk, we've used a few other ones that we've found useful for the area listed here. The U.S. Drought Monitor, and even using shallow groundwater monitoring wells is a really good way to determine conditions as well. So we want to use all the tools available to us. And the tool we're talking about today is the Antecedent Precipitation Tool. And now this is a free program that was developed and updated by the Corps. And you can see here the website where it's listed, but you can simply type in Antecedent Precipitation Tool, and you'll come to this GitHub page, which is where the program is actually housed. It's free to use for anyone to use. And what this does is it assesses the rainfall data from the preceding 30 years, and it's pulling all of that from local data as close to your observation point as it can pull. It's automated and provides a consistent methodology following those calculations. It also includes information from a couple of other resources, WebWimp, and also the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And it does also follow what the preamble recommendations are as to how the calculation should be done. So once you get it installed, this is a look at what it looks like. It puts a shortcut on your desktop. You open it up and you get a window that looks like this. This is the actual program. You can see here Mr. Jason Dieters was the one who developed this, and I believe he wrote the program actually in Python. And once it loads up, you get a graphical user interface shown here in the lower right hand corner. And that's where you actually type in your information. Here you can see latitude, longitude. So that's your point. So here we're looking at a scope of a single point. You have a few options for the scope. You can make it a little bit larger, look at different HUC codes to get a watershed analysis. You can also input a custom polygon that I think Eli might talk about. Then when you're actually running the tool, you can select a single date, you can add additional dates, or you can actually put in a date range. And then if you want to run a whole lot of dates, you can actually input a CSV file in order to run a large amount of dates that way. So once you, so what we do is we put in our latitude and longitude, and here I picked one of Oliver's favorite spots, the fountain there at Lewis Ginter Botanical Gardens, where we all wish we were today. But I put in the lat and long as a single point, and I put in the date range. I put in a single date, which I put in as last Saturday. The thing to point out about the date is that you can only run it up to 2 days from the current date, and that's because the precipitation data has to get posted from the different stations and verified and all those things. I wanted to point out that there's a little question mark up here for help. I'll say that this is very useful. There is lots of information in there. PDFs come with the program to help you walk through a lot of it. So after you run it, it spits out an output into the folder structure where you saved the tool, and you'll see that it shows the Latin long. And in there, there'll be two main things. One is a PDF that'll actually show the output. The other is a CSV, and this CSV actually shows the precipitation data that was used for the calculations. When you run the tool, you'll see some outputs within the tool. This right here is the WebWimp, which I mentioned earlier. And this is a methodology to determine if we are in the wet or dry season for the area that you're interested in. Here you can see that for the selected month, we are in the wet season. The tool used to spit out a nice graph like this, but it doesn't do that anymore. You have to go to the website to get a graph like this, but it basically shows for this area the switch from where we're in a surplus of soil moisture to where we're going towards a deficit of soil moisture into our dry season and coming back the other way. So useful information for when we're performing our determinations. This is just a quick shot of the CSV file. You can see that it's going back 30 years, and the other thing that it's doing is that it's using a composite of data from different locations. So some of the data may be from one weather station, some may be from another weather station, but it's there for you to see. Okay, so here's the main output from the tool. So we're going to start along the x-axis down here. We have time moving along the x-axis. Along the y-axis, we have rainfall measured in inches. The blue line is the first one we'll focus on. That is a 30-day rolling total of precipitation. So that's adding up the previous 30 days and continuing to do that as it rolls through time. Along the bottom here, we actually see daily precipitation values. So these little spikes, here, if we remember, this is that August 2020 date where we had I'll use the word extreme rainfall during that month, and we can see that our 30-day rolling total was very high, but we can see the actual precipitation events down here near the x-axis. Now the shaded area, this is the 30-year normal range, and what's really unique about this is that it is calculating a normal, our 30th down at the bottom, and the 70th percentile for each day based on 30 years of data. So this is unique. Normally, we would use to here at the Corps, we would look at it maybe on a monthly basis. We would look at calculating our 30th and 70th percentiles, but what this gives you is a nice daily normal range. Also here on the graph, we can see our observation date indicated here by this arrow pointing to that date. We can see the preceding 30-day period indicated here. So you can see that that one was above, and then the preceding 30-day total here. Moving over to the left-hand side, we can see some information in this table. We have our coordinates, the observation date. So this would be the date that you were in the field or that maybe your aerial was taken, and that's the date you're interested in. It gives you a calculation of elevation. I think this comes from maybe USGS. It is useful when comparing to other weather stations. Here you can see it produced the drought index, the PDSI, of extreme wetness for this time period. And based on the WebWimp, it indicates that we are still in the wet season. All right, moving over to this table here, this is where the main calculation happens. And so what we can see here at the top is we can see our observation date first. We can see our 30 days ending in that. It actually tells us what our 30th and 70th percentile were for that time period, that day, sorry, for that specific day. And we can see our observed value, 3.2, which corresponds with this point right here. And what we can see is that 3.2 fell within our 30th and 70th percentile, so it received a wetness condition of normal. Moving back 30 days, we do the same sort of calculation, and we can see that it got a wetness condition of wet, and we can see that reflected here, well above the 70th percentile. The last 30th day fell within the normal range, so it got a condition value wetness condition of normal. These are then transformed into actual numeric values. So normal gets a 2, dry gets a 1, and wet gets a 3. The other unique thing that this calculation does is it weights the preceding 30 days. So obviously the most recent precipitation data gets the highest weight, while the oldest precipitation data gets the lowest weight. Then the calculation is to multiply these two numbers together, our condition value and our weight. We receive a product. From that, we sum that and we get a total of 14, and it indicates here that this is normal conditions. And so the range that they're using for this tool to determine normal versus wetter versus drier is shown here. So what we can see is that we're at the high end of the normal condition, which range from 10 to 14. So the tool here is indicating that at this particular day, at this observation date, the precipitation conditions were normal. And the other thing that it shows down here in the lower right-hand side is the location from where the weather data came from. And this is for both the normal 30-year total and also for the antecedent or current precipitation conditions. And you'll see that it's pulling a composite. So we got some from Ashland Hanover County Municipal Airport, and then it got some also from Ashland, which I'm not sure what that one was, but it pulled a couple of other values from different places. But you can see that it pulled the rainfall data from the current rainfall data from that municipal airport. The other thing I want to point out, and I meant to do this earlier, is that this is not looking at a year. This is looking at the 3 30-day preceding precipitation values. And so that's looking at 90 days. So the term typical year is slightly misleading in my opinion. Because you can look at, as the definition states, you can look at a normal periodic range, meaning that you could look at a whole year if the conditions warranted that, or you could look at some other sort of range. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to step back one day just to kind of illustrate what happens when we go back one observation date. So here you can see I put Friday the 19th as our date, and you can see everything jumped back one date from there. So we're at the 20th, now we roll back, and now we can see that our condition value on the 19th actually changed, and we can see that we had a precipitation event occur around that time period, which actually changed our wetness condition to wet, our condition value, and then our sum actually now is above 14, so it considers it wetter than normal for that particular observation point. All right, so that's a lot of information. I hope it was something useful there, but we're always open to questions. And I wanted to thank you all for having us here. This is my home office. This is all my contact information. If you need anything, have any questions, feel free to reach out. This is from Lewis Ginter. I went this winter and saw some interesting plants and witch hazel. That's what that is. Some witch hazel in flower. And you can see my little microscope over here. I'm trying to take some pictures. And these are my current coworkers. This is Forrest, Violet, and Reed. They're good coworkers, but they tend to get a little messy in the break room when they eat spaghetti. But they're pretty good. So with that, I will stop there, and I will kick it over to Eli.
Thanks, Wes. And I'll just go ahead and pop up my presentation. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks, Wes, for going through that. I really appreciate that. As mentioned, my name is Eli Wright. I work with Timmons Group, and I'm a senior environmental scientist here, working primarily in environmental consulting, primarily everything to do with wetlands and regulatory environment centered around that. So deeply involved in any changes such as the Navigable Water Protection Rule that came through last year. And I have since then been interested in the APT and trying to figure out how to use it, how to best incorporate it into my workflows. And so today I wanted to share some of the applications I've seen to help incorporate that into what we do and show some real life examples. So as I go through this, I am pulling from real projects that I've worked on. So you may see some things blocked out just to give some privacy to clients, but hopefully we can all pick up something new to learn from this today. So as Wes had talked about, there are some definitely intended uses and applications for the APT. Primarily, it develops with the Navigable Water Protection Rule and the definitions associated with that rule change. In addition, it's a tool that was designed for watershed analysis purposes. And that was seen, as Wes pointed out, in the scope. You could actually look at different HUCs or insert custom polygons that are intended to do watershed analyses. But what I'm interested in today is talking a little bit about some of the maybe unintended applications, or just kind of stretching a tool, being able to utilize it for some of the day-to-day purposes that we have, and trying to make some practical applications here. Primarily, one of the first things that's really helpful is the historic data that it provides. As Wes showed, it provides 30 years worth of data at a click of a button. Previously, we'd have to go to different weather stations and download the data. It can be cumbersome to deal with, so it's nice to have one tool that's able to pull all those features into a single application. Other things that you can use it for, particularly in Virginia, stream flow determinations. I find it helpful to review the APT, looking at not only in the context of the Navigable Water Protection Rule, looking at between ephemeral and intermittent, but also for things such as RPA, look at the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act requirements, looking at intermittent to perennial. And a lot of those methodologies require that you look at the stream after a certain amount of precipitation, make sure you're looking at basically the normal conditions. So I find this tool is helpful to use that as another tool in the toolbox to make some of those determinations and help justify some of the things, decisions and calls that we're making while in the field. Finally, the one thing that I really want to dig in deep to on here today is talking about using the APT to interpret some of the hydrology indicators associated that you might come across in a delineation. So before I get into that, I wanted to throw out the definition here of wetlands. It's one of those definitions that I'm sure everyone has seen, but I think it's helpful to refer back to. It's the same definition that we have in Virginia as it is for the Corps, as for the EPA. It's the same definition everywhere. But the one thing I wanted to point about this definition is the components of frequency and duration and normal circumstances. And I think those are some of the things that we can help to get to with the APT, particularly as it relates to hydrology, being able to look at the normal conditions or the typical year kind of question that Wes was referring to. So in the first example I'm going to share, it's looking at hydrology indicators associated with interpreting aerial imagery. Those primarily would be the B7 indicator and the C9 indicator, looking at inundation and saturation on aerial imagery. I know a lot of us probably have come across these types of projects before. So the first example here is from southeastern Virginia. It's looking at a farm field and looking at some of the aerial imagery you might look at as you're getting ready to do your initial due diligence desktop recon on a site. Before I dig too deep in this, I do want to recognize, I understand that there's a lot of discussion that could be had around agricultural fields and prior converted croplands and how that relates to the Navigable Water Protection Rule. I don't necessarily want to get into that conversation right now, but I'm just showing the agricultural example because it's easy to show with aerial imagery. So in this example, like I mentioned, we have a site here that's a field that's in agriculture. You can see from the topo that's a slightly graded site that goes from higher elevation at the front of the site on the road frontage, kind of slowly sloping back to the back of the site. This is less than a 1% grade. And you can see, particularly in this image, there's a darker spot here. And this is actually corresponds with a topo line that's a depression in this site. And you might see this and see that might look like that's inundation or saturation on this aerial imagery. You might see some more in the back of the site as well. Looking at some of the other desktop features we have, we see that there's a NWI forested wetland shown on the back side of the site. So very typical for southeastern Virginia. And you see another aerial imagery with a lot of saturation in the back and potentially even saturation on this the front side here. But one of the things I would like to point out with these aerial imagery indicators is that in the user notes in the regional supplements associated with these indicators, it points out that the observer needs to be aware of the hydrologic conditions at the time that these aerial images were taken. And that's, I think, what the APT is great to be used for. So primarily when I'm doing this desktop recon, I try to look at aerial images that are from the early part of the growing season, the early spring, particularly, I think that's important in Virginia, southeastern Virginia, when the water table is the highest and when we typically have wetland hydrology indicators being met. And that tends to be the wet season. So I went back and looked at, again, I think Google Earth is a great, easy tool that people can use. Everyone can download, it's free. And this is images that I found from that early part of the growing season for this site. So we have one that's from March of 1994, February of 2013, and April of 2014. And looking at these images, we can see, particularly I want to focus on this depression that we saw in the front part of the field. And the 94 image, we can see that there's some indications of saturation in the soil in this depression. Maybe a little bit in the back, but definitely some in the front here. Again, looking at 2013, we see that same kind of wet signature, maybe a little bit bigger, definitely wet in the back, but we see that pretty clearly here. And then finally, in this 2014 image, we don't quite see that wet signature very clearly, although we may see some of that back in the field near these ditches. So if you're just looking at these three images, you may consider that the C9 indicator might be applicable. 2 of the 3 years that you have data for, it seems like it's saturated. That might be worth checking that indicator. But again, those user notes are important, and you want to make sure that you're looking at and understanding the hydrological conditions that precede these photos. And that's where the APT tool comes in. So as Wes mentioned, you can easily add your XY coordinates for the site as a single point, and you can add multiple dates. You just kind of click through, add dates as you need to, and hit calculate. Very simple, very easy, and it gives you some really great data. So the first thing that pops out when you run these multiple data sets is it's called batch results, and it provides a PDF for each date that you've run. It's not necessarily important. I know these are small pictures. It's not necessary that you read each of these. I just want to point out that it does produce a separate graphic for each individual date. The thing that is really nice about this is that it also produces an Excel file that summarizes this data into an easy to read format, where it provides each of the dates, the Palmer Drought Severity Index, the season, and this condition, in this particular example, I've run this multiple times, but for some reason it wasn't able to produce the wet or dry season. That's normally what we've said there. And then also the basically the end result, the antecedent precipitation condition, which is pulling the end result from each of these columns into this table. So then going back to our graphics, we can see that for these first 2 images, these were actually taken in what was considered wetter than normal conditions, while the final image was taken in normal condition. So in normal circumstances, you might not actually see saturation in a field in the spring months, while in the wetter conditions, you might actually see this depression actually has saturation. And that might be enough to get to help you make a decision, a determination while observing these points in the field. But I also think it's a little helpful to dig a little bit deeper into the data and actually pull what Wes had mentioned before, go into the station data files and pull the individual data for the dates and kind of look at that, how they relate to your observation points. So what I did is opened up this merged station, converted into inches folder, and looked at our examples, each one individually, to see what was going on leading up to these area photos being taken. So again, here we have the March 94 date, which is shown on this block here, and looking at basically the previous 2 or 3 weeks leading up to that observation. And as you can see here, there wasn't any rain in the preceding few days, even just a really trace amount. So not much in that first week, but kind of getting a week out, we had a rainfall runoff producing event at about 1/4 of an inch. But even further back, 10 days back or so, we had multiple rain events that were pretty substantial. And you can see that this actually corresponds, these numbers, this cluster of events is actually this cluster of events is 3 days right here. So you can see that's where that large spike comes from in this graphic. Something else that's worth noting is that the data here shows that it was actually been a pretty wet spring. If you look back to December of that year, it was a little bit drier than normal, but then January, February, into March, it's all been a very wet spring. And as a result of that wet spring, we're seeing potentially that this depression is looking saturated. So this may not be a normal circumstance, and we have to consider that while looking at this aerial image. Moving on to the next year, February 24th of 2013. What I like to point out in this example, here's the date, that our observation date. This is the day before. It had rained a ½ an inch the day before, more than a ½ an inch, and even rained on the day of the observation itself. So again, if you're thinking about a depression in a field, it wouldn't be unusual for there to be saturation in that depression. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's meeting the indicators of a wetland or wetland hydrology. So it's really, again, really important to look at this type of data and not just look at the baseline normal or wetter than normal. So finally, our last date, this is the date that was considered to be the normal condition here, where we didn't see saturation in the front part of this field. We have our observation date of April 24th, 2014. And as you can see, there wasn't any rain in the few days preceding it, some trace amounts. And then if you get back 10 days back, you get pretty substantial rainfall. But so again, we can look at our conditions here. You can see that the 30-day rolling total is really well within the 30-year range. As Wes mentioned, it's very rare to actually have this kind of occurrence where you have 3 or 4 months in a row where it's all within the average range. So apparently, April of 2014, when that spring was right on. So this is actually a pretty good example of what a normal condition might be for this site. And as we can see from the image, you don't really see the saturation in the soil on this particular image in the front part of the field. You may see it around the ditches in the back here. So this helps to provide some extra evidence and prepares you as you're going out to the field to make your determinations. But of course, you always need to field verify. So these images are taken from around June of last year, this site. And this is the back side of the field. And as we kind of saw from those data that we were looking at, this is kind of what we would expect to see. There's stunted growth, sparsely vegetated surfaces. There's even some soil cracks that aren't showing up in this image, but this would be more indicative of a wetland condition, or what I would potentially consider might be wetland hydrology indicators. As compared to the front side of the field in June of last year, it was a lush, well-productive soy field. So even though we're maybe seeing some of these wet signatures on aerial imagery, doesn't necessarily, you have to take that into the context of when those images were taken. So you always need to use best professional judgment. So the next topic I wanted to jump onto is kind of extending this out to some of the other hydrology indicators, particularly those indicators that may form at an earlier part of the growing season and might persist through the rest of the season. Some of those indicators are listed here, things like drift deposits, soil surface cracks, and water stained leaves. These are hydrology indicators that can form during the early part of the growing season and may form in non-wetland areas. Again, if you look at the user notes, they caution the observer to make sure that they are aware of the hydrological conditions that cause these things. Example, with drift deposits, you may have an extreme storm event that causes a bank to overflow that typically doesn't ever overflow in a normal year. And you might end up getting these drift deposits that are a primary sign of hydrology, but you have to be careful if you're going to check that box on your data form. Same thing with the soil surface cracks and the water stained leaves. These are things that can form in non-wetland areas in extreme events. Conversely, these can also, you might lack these on your site when in a normal year they may occur. So and if you have a dry condition during those early spring months when they typically would be forming, you might not have those on your site. So you need to take that into consideration. Again, it's all putting these different pieces into context while you're making a site evaluation. Here's an example that I want to show. This is from the Richmond International Airport, just to point the XY at that point. So obviously it took all the data just from that weather station. But this is from 2014, and I chose October 31st so we can kind of get a good swath of the year. We can see the data going back all the way from April the year, this early or the late spring the year before, all the way up to March in 2015. But what I think is important to note here is that there was basically a drought. I mean, if you look at October of 2014, it was drier than normal conditions, and you can see that played out in the 30-day rolling totals, that you had multiple dips below normal and then kind of peaking up into normal. So if you're looking at a wetland and you're coming out here into this next year, sometime in April of 2016, you have to think about this type of site and the wetlands you have. If you have a groundwater-driven system, there's this potential that it didn't get a chance to recharge the year before, but there was an extreme drawdown due to this drought. So you may be lacking some of those hydrology indicators that you would normally have at that site. So just something to be aware of. Looking in the past, using the APT is a great tool for that, to understand what's going on in your site today. Conversely, this is this year. This is same Richmond International Airport. The date was just run from October 2020, but again, this shows you all the way from our current date here, March, all the way back to the previous year. And this is what Wes had mentioned. We had this extreme precipitation event. We had multiple days in a row with rainfall over 2 inches or near 2 inches. And if you look at the scale of this, I mean, you see the 30-year rolling average, and how the scale goes up to 16. I'm going to flip back to the previous slide just so you can see. I mean, this is really tight here. This is a more typical year. Yes, it's drier than normal, but it's really tight around our 30-year normal range. I'm going to flip forward to the next slide, and you can see again extreme wetness here, all the way up almost to where we are today. So you may be having situations where you have wetland hydrology indicators that are forming, that have formed because of the wetness that we've had over the past year, that are going to persist into this coming year. And you, as a delineator, just need to be aware of those indicators, that it may not actually be a normal circumstance. So you have to take that all into consideration. Finally, the next thing I want to talk about is the use of the custom polygon feature. And Wes had mentioned that if you look at your APT user interface, you have this option to change the scope to a custom polygon. Now, the intended use of the custom polygon, from my reading, is that it's intended to be used for watershed analysis. As it was shown before, the scope can include HUCs, predetermined HUCs, or you can enter a custom polygon, which again was designed to be imported into a watershed, whether one that you delineated yourself, or you could pull custom watersheds from different services like StreamStats and the likes. But what I find this custom polygon tool to be helpful for is actually evaluation of large sites. Think about, particularly if I know solar has become a big driver in Virginia, and looking at these large sites. So an example I've got here is a 1,200 acre site in Western Virginia, that if you're looking about running the APT and trying to, getting ready to do your site work out here, you want to know if conditions are normal, or if it's a typical year, you might just run a centroid polygon point in the center of your site here. But given the size of the site, there's the potential that you might actually get varying results depending on where you put that polygon, especially a site that has, again, a lot of area and elevation changes, because as we know, elevation can change how climatic conditions occur. So down near the lower part of the site, up to the upper part of the site, you end up having this 350-foot elevation change, which might actually result in different outcomes. So by using this custom polygon tool, you can actually, it generates a multi-random point feature that actually lets you evaluate the entire site. Let me go back real quick. Apologies. So how you use this feature is basically you do the same thing. You use the date that you want to evaluate, and you can run multiple dates. You enter, it says a watershed name, but this is again your project name or whatever you want to call that particular polygon. And then you enter a shapefile for that polygon. It needs to be in a zipped folder, but it's pretty easy. You just load up your shapefile and hit calculate. And what it produces is a graphic that looks like this. So going through this graphic quickly, it gives you your observation date, and it gives you the name of the polygon that you decided to use. It says watershed size. This is actually the size of the polygon that you imported. So it's actually your site size. That 1.8 square miles is equivalent to that 1,200 acres. And based on the size of your site that you're looking at, the tool evaluates the number of randomly selected sample points that would be appropriate for that polygon size. So in this example, the tool decided 6 observation points for this polygon was the appropriate sample. So I'm going to jump down to this bottom table, and this actually breaks out when it ran. So for each of those 6 random points, the tool ran a separate evaluation, one of those spreadsheets that we were looking at. So if you look at the number of points over here, one of those 6 observation points ended up with a normal condition and a score of 10. 5 of those 6 points, the remaining 5, ended up with a drier than normal condition and given it a score of 7. And that's what's reflected in this pie chart here. So again, 83% of the random sampled points, the 5 of the 6 were drier than normal, and 1 of the 6, or 17%, was normal conditions. So the tool then takes all that data, gives you a simple output. It says that you've got an overall score of 7.5, and that your overall site's drier than normal. And you can actually dig into the data a little bit more and see where it's actually pulling the 6 random points from. So I just imported those into a Google Earth image here, so you can actually see where these random points were generated across the site. And when you dig into the data, you can actually look at it a little bit closer and figure out, okay, so 5 of my points were considered drier than normal, and 1 was considered normal. Which one was which? And in this example, this F point, this F station, was the normal condition, and the other 5 were drier than normal. So I'm going to look at the examples just to show you some of the additional outputs between B, which was really representative of these first 5, and F. So we're going to jump between B and F here. So this is station B, and as we saw, it came out with a condition of drier than normal. The things I want to point out on this graphic is, first off, the elevation at that site that was determined by the tool was 620 feet or so. And it also pulled most of the data that it was utilizing from this Alta Vista weather station. And as you can see, it pulled most of the normal days and most of the antecedent days from that particular weather station, which had an elevation difference from that site of about 90 feet. So the elevation at that site is 528 feet versus the 620 here. And it's about 4 miles away, but that's where it's pulling most of the data from, because that's what the tool decided was the best, or the algorithm the tool decided was the best station for that site. The last thing I want to point out is this last 30 days here, just to contrast that with the next image I'm going to go to, which is that far right station, station F. So I'm going to jump here and keep an eye on this last 30 days. So as you can see, there was a major precipitation event in this last 30 days that is included in the data results for station F that wasn't included in the last example of station B. So again, we have a normal, drier than normal, and that results, again, in our normal condition here. And the reason why I did this is because I think primarily is the elevation difference. So the last site we were looking at had an elevation of 620 or so, and this current site is at 807. And if you look at the weather station that it ended up pulling most of the data from, as you recall previously, it was the Alta Vista site. But in this example, it's not pulling hardly any data from that station. It's pulling all of it from the Huddleston station. And the reason is because it has a much more similar elevation. It's only, again, a 90-foot difference from the observation point versus the Alta Vista, which is a 280 difference. So again, it's just understanding how these tools are generated and understanding why you might be getting different results within the same site. So even though these two sites are only a mile and a half apart, you can get a normal condition for this particular part of the site and a drier than normal condition in this part of the site. And maybe that's accurate. Maybe the elevation, maybe you are getting more rain at the higher elevation site. But again, this custom polygon tool helps to break that down a little bit and look at the overall site rather than just trying to do a single point for these large areas. Last thing I want to touch on is a little bit of troubleshooting for the APT. It's a great program. You can use it for a lot of things, but it's also finicky. There is a lot of different types of errors you can get, anything from a not responding message to, as we saw in the previous example, you might not get some of your Palmer drought values or your seasonal values. You might just get complete gibberish that's populated. So if anyone's a fan of the IT crowd, I mean, the great adage in IT in general, have you tried turning it on and off again? First step is just close everything. I find that if you just close the whole program down, restart it, that solves the problem 80% of the time. Other things that you might want to try doing is running the program during government hours. This tool pulls a lot of data from a lot of government websites, anything from USGS to NOAA and the likes. So a lot of those services, the servers are down or being maintained or being upgraded during non-business hours. So you may not be getting results as a result of one of those servers being down. So always make sure you want to run it ahead of time, as much time as you can, because I've gotten to the situations where, okay, I'm going out to a site visit. I need to know what happened recently at that site. I need to run, I've got 5 minutes in the office before I got to get out, and the tool doesn't work. So again, just plan ahead as much as you can. And you may have to wait, a few days or hours. I've even had to wait a week before I was able to get a result to come through. So play around with it and have fun. I mean, it's a great tool, and it's like any program. The more you use it, the more you get familiar with it, and you feel more comfortable with it. And as Wes mentioned, there is that really great About feature that if you click on that, it pops up all these different PDF instructions that are part of the program that talks anything from about how the methodologies are determined to how to interpret some of these results. So with that, I say get out there, get dirty, have some fun, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen.
Thank you, Eli. And I wanted to say a big thanks to both Eli and Wes for their presentations and joining us, and an appreciation for Timmons Group for hosting this event. As I mentioned, this is the 4th of 5 webinar series. Please join us on the March 31st, so that's a week from now, for the Army Corps' regulatory update, followed by the VOP annual business meeting, and a few speaking notes from Laura Rader-Dixon, our outgoing VOP president. So yeah, big appreciation to everyone that put together this event. There's some folks in the background doing a lot of good work making this happen. So we're going to open this to questions. There is a Q&A feature, and you'll submit your questions. Mics are default closed, and you will not be able to speak your questions, so you'll need to type it in. And you're welcome to address it to either Eli, Wes, or both. To start us off with, Wes, question is, if you are on a site and you've got local knowledge that a particular rain event happened, and yes, you did nail it, that a particular rain event happened and the tool is pulling from a weather station that assigned to that either polygon or point that doesn't say have that rain event recorded. Is there a way to change or work in the algorithm to adjust which station it pulls from?
Yeah, good question, Katie. And I don't believe so, but what you could do is you could manually do the calculation. You wouldn't be able to update the 30-year total, but you really wouldn't need to do that. What you could basically do is sort of do the calculation by hand and add it in that way. Yeah, and that's definitely a challenge, is that especially in Virginia, we get these local just microbursts, for lack of a better word, where it just pours in one particular spot. So going back to sort of that best professional judgment and using that as a resource, yes, that it would have to be done sort of manually, and but definitely should be taken into account.
Great, thank you. And I'll be alternating with Ben for our Q&A.
Cool. Thank you, Wes. So I got a question for Eli, and maybe Wes can help out with this one as well, but seems like we've got a question as to the accuracy of the dates on the Google Earth images. Have either of you had any issues with accuracy on the dates? It sounds like the person asking the question has compared the metadata with images from VBMP, and they haven't always lined up.
Yeah, so that is an issue on some of the aerial image I have noticed before. So it is always important to make sure you understand the data sources that you're using for anything that you're using. I do find the VGen data sets to be pretty accurate in Virginia. If you can use those aerials, they usually come with pretty good dates and metadata. Google Earth does have some of the issues. What I find on Google Earth is there's a couple different dates it will give you, depending on where you're clicking on the site. Sometimes if you're on a site, it may be two different aerial composites. So you may be getting a date for one of those aerials versus the other. So just be careful when you're looking at that. It makes a difference, as Wes shown, if you change a date here or there, whether or not you get a condition score. But depending on how you're using it, you may just be looking at the general trend for that season. So it may not be as important. It really depends on what you're trying to use that tool for, what question you're trying to answer, of how important the specific date is. But to answer the question, I have noticed that issue before. Did you have anything to add to that, Wes?
No, I second that, especially with some of the older aerial imagery, which was flown by, I think, some of it was the Forest Service. Yeah, that it gets a little hazy in the fog of history. So I have noticed that they don't line up, and so yeah, that is a concern just due to the fact the way that the tool is operating. But yes, we do the best we can with what we got.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I've definitely seen those images where you kind of have two different images kind of fused together over top of one site. So I think it's definitely worth just verifying that that's not happening on your site.
Great point. Another question, does the daily precipitation data Excel file automatically export when you run the ATP tool? And if not, could you explain how to get that daily precipitation data?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yes, it does automatically export it. And I showed that spreadsheet in my presentation, and it in looking at it, though, the problem there's only one small problem with it, I think, is that it doesn't show you which weather station the data was from. So if you have a composite, say you pulled some data from one station and some data from another station, it does it automatically. It doesn't differentiate those two data sources. So I'm not sure how to rectify that, or if it is something. But I'll make a note, because the people who created this, they just reached out to all of us for more information or feedback on the tool. So that's very useful feedback.
Something to add to that I've noticed while using the tool is, again, most of the time when I'm running this, I might be trying to do it for a site visit that I have coming up. So I'll be running it, as Wes had mentioned, for the date that's 2 days previous. And as was mentioned, that it's pulling data from these weather stations once it's been reviewed and verified by NOAA or USGS or whoever the owner operator of that station is. So if you're trying to run something that's even 2 days old, I've noticed that I might have a limited number of weather stations that's actually reported at that point. If I were to go back 2 weeks later and run that same exact date for that same exact XY coordinate, I might get different results because it might be pulling from weather stations that have actually been updated and are now closer or more accurate. So it's important to recognize that. I have done that before. I pulled my results, had them part of my delineation confirmation package, and there were different results from what the regulator had pulled, because again, if you go back, you look at the data, it's pulling from different weather stations. So that's something just to keep an eye on and kind of be aware of what your data source is.
Great. I think we got one more question here. Eli and Wes, do both of you two run this ATP tool before like any site visit or every confirmation visit, or is this something that you are using mostly if you feel like you're outside of normal conditions, or if you get onto a site and you look around, some things look a little unusual, and so you're wondering if non-normal conditions happen before your site visit.
That's a good question. Yeah, I try to run it whenever I'm going out to try and get a feel for what's going on. So, and the other thing I wanted to point out, which is that Eli sort of touched on it, is that he submits this with his delineation package. So we really encourage that that to be part of the submittal, because this gets everybody on the same page. We're all looking at the same precipitation data, so that's greatly appreciated when this data is submitted with it. But yeah, I'll look at this and I'll look at those other resources that I mentioned as well to get a feel for the current conditions. And in Norfolk, we have a team of us who periodically review precipitation data, and we send it out internally as to what we think the conditions are like, how things are changing. That goes along with our, we have some shallow groundwater monitoring wells in southeastern Virginia where we monitor groundwater. So we try to keep a handle or a feel for what's happening out there.
This has been wonderful. Thank you both. And a big thanks again to Timmons for hosting. I think that's all the time we've got today. Really appreciate the engagement. And March 31st, a week from today, is our next and final of our Wednesday webinar series in lieu of our annual spring meeting. And we'll conclude that one. We'll have the full standard hour with Q&A. And then afterward, we'll have the annual business meeting with an address from Laura Rader Dixon. So big appreciation to everyone today, and have a good rest of your afternoon.